The 17th presidential election was on November 2nd, 1852. This election was consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Whig, Free Soil, Union, Native American, and Southern Rights parties. The Democratic Party chose former New Hampshire Senator Franklin Pierce as their presidential candidate, and Alabama Senator William R. King as their vice presidential candidate. The Whig Party was divided while choosing who to choose for their nominees. Millard Fillmore, who was the incumbent president, had support from the South, but Winfield Scott had support from the North. In the end, the Whig Party wanted to have a closer identification with the North. The Whigs chose Commanding General Winfield Scott as their presidential candidate, and Secretary to the Navy William A. Graham as their vice presidential candidate. As the Free Soil parties were losing support, with their supporters going back to either the Democratic or Whig parties, they continued to pursue their anti-slavery agenda. The Free Soil Party chose New Hampshire Senator John P. Hale as their presidential candidate and George Washington Julian as their vice presidential nominee. The Union Party was created as an anti-Scott party, but shared many of the same beliefs as the Whig Party. They chose Daniel Webster as their presidential candidate and Charles J. Jenkins as their vice presidential candidate. The Native American Party was an anti-immigration party. They chose Jacob Broome as their presidential candidate and Raynell Coates as their vice presidential candidate. The Southern Rights Party was made up of former Democratic Party members who supported secession from the Union. As they didn't want to support peace, they chose former Georgia Senator George Trout as their presidential candidate and former Mississippi Governor John A. Quitman as their vice presidential candidate. The Whigs and Democrats ran on the personality of their nominees rather than policy. Scott's anti-slavery stance hurt his performance in southern states. Only 9 days before the election, Daniel Webster died and caused the Union Party to fall apart. In the end, Franklin Pierce won 50.84% of the popular vote and 85.81% of the electoral vote. This was the best performance in the popular vote since 1840, and the best performance in the electoral vote since 1820. As the people are still very divided with who they should vote for due to the very polarizing topic of slavery, the popular vote was nearly 50-50. But a supermajority of states agreed on choosing Pierce for president. The 18th presidential election was on November 4th, 1856. This election consisted of 3 parties. These were the Democratic, Republican, and American parties. In this election, 168 years ago, was the first election that was held by the same 2 major parties that would run the government for the rest of the United States history. The Democratic Party chose Minister to Great Britain James Buchanan as their presidential candidate and former representative for Kentucky's 8th District John C. Breckinridge as their vice presidential candidate. The Republican Party was founded in opposition of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act made it so the new state could vote on whether it would be a free or slave state. This ended up with thousands of hardliners moving to the state to call themselves a citizen and vote on the topic. But as it would make sense, with thousands of political headliners on opposite sides flocking to one area, they began to fight each other. This led to the event called Bleeding Kansas, where 200 people were killed. The Republican Party chose former California Senator John C. Fremont as their presidential candidate, and former New Jersey Senator William L. Dayton as their vice presidential candidate. The American Party was the Native American Party, but rebranded. This party actually outperformed the Republicans in the midterm elections before and were classified as the Democrats' main opposition. After the Whig Party collapsed, most of their supporters shifted towards the American Party. The party was divided on the topic of slavery, though. The American Party chose former President Millard Fillmore as their presidential candidate, and former envoy to Prussia, Andrew J. Donelson, as their vice presidential candidate. The Republican Party campaigned on halting the expansion of slavery. The slogan was "Free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont, and victory." They called for Kansas to be admitted as a free state to stop the violence within the territory. They opposed the annexation of Cuba. They believed the slavery went against the purpose of the founding of the United States. On the other hand, Democrats wanted Kansas to be admitted as a slave state, Cuba to be annexed, and the expansion of slavery. Democrats said that if Republicans won the election, many Democratic states would secede from the Union. Democrats said that Republicans would use the military to help free the slaves, which would then spark a civil war. The American Party claimed that they were the only national party due to the Republicans campaigning for pro-Northern policy while the Democrats campaigned for pro-Southern policy. They created a false rumor that Fremont was a Catholic, which cost him the election. The reason this was such a big problem was because people believed that if there was a Catholic president, then the Pope would have power over the president, essentially giving him power of the president over to the Pope. James Buchanan ended up winning the election. He won 45.28% of the popular vote and 58.78% of the electoral vote. This was the worst performance on the popular vote since 1824, and the worst electoral vote since 1824. So far, this was the most polarizing election in American history. A majority of Americans couldn't decide on a candidate, and there wasn't a comfortable amount of states backing one candidate. On top of that, the Democrats were calling for a civil war if Republicans won. The 19th presidential election was held on November 6, 1860. This election consisted of 4 parties. These parties were the Republican, Southern Democratic, Constitutional Union, and Northern Democratic parties. The Republican Party was unsure of who to vote for since a good number of people running were former Democrats. After the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln became a popular figure within the Republican Party. As the delegates could not make up their minds if they should either choose Seward or Lincoln as their nominees, they eventually chose former representative from Illinois' 7th District, Abraham Lincoln, as their presidential candidate, and former Maine Senator Hannibal Hamlin as their vice presidential candidate. The Northern Democratic Party chose Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas as their presidential candidate, and Georgia Senator Herschel V. Johnson as their presidential or vice presidential candidate. Some Democrats believed that Douglas was too moderate on slavery and decided to form an independent Southern faction of the Democratic Party. The Southern Democrats chose Vice President John C. Breckinridge as their presidential candidate and Oregon Senator Joseph Lane as their vice presidential candidate. The Constitutional Union Party was made up of former American and Whig Party supporters who did not want to vote Republican or Democratic. They chose former Tennessee Senator John Bell as their presidential candidate and former Massachusetts Senator Edward Everett as their vice presidential candidate. This election was 100% about the topic of slavery. Due to the split between the Northern and Southern Democrats, Lincoln was able to win the election. He won 39.82% of the popular vote and 59.41% of the electoral vote. This was the worst any winning candidate had performed in the popular vote. The electoral vote performance was a slight improvement from the prior election. This was at the time, and still is as of September 15th, 2024, the most polarizing election in American history. But it's not just because the winning candidate only got 1/3 of the popular vote, but because of what happened after the election. Due to Lincoln winning the presidency between December 20th, 1860 to February 1st, 1861, the Southern Democrats lived up to their threats that they threatened. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas formed the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, who failed to become the Southern Democratic nominee, was elected as the President of the Confederate States. This was due to the fears that the federal government would free the slaves within the southern states. On March 6, 1861, Davis called for 100,000 Confederate men to enlist in the military. 1 month later, he ordered his troops to invade Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina then joined the Confederation. Lincoln had no choice but to declare war on the Confederate States. Soon after, the Northern Democrats put their support behind Lincoln. The 20th presidential election was on November 8, 1864. This election consisted of two parties. These parties were the National Union and Democratic parties. The National Union Party was created by the joining of all parties in the United States under one party. They chose President Abraham Lincoln to be their presidential candidate and military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, to be their vice presidential candidate. The Democratic Party was anyone who supported the South but lived in the North. They chose former commanding general George B. McClellan as their presidential candidate and Representative for Ohio's 1st District George H. Pendleton as their vice presidential candidate. At this point in time, the Union was not performing well in the war. To many, it looked like it was going to be a long war, and to some, the idea of peace between the Union and Confederacy talked about by the Democrats seemed to be the most likely idea. And fighting within the Democratic Party over if they should be pro or anti-Confederacy almost paralyzed the party. But after the storming of Mobile Bay and the fall of Atlanta, Georgia, people began to have more hopes for a Union victory, which in turn made Lincoln more popular. Many people also thought it would be too risky to put a different president in power during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln ended up winning the election. He won 55.02% of the popular vote and 91.63% of the electoral vote. This was the best performance within the popular vote since 1828 and the best performance in the electoral vote since 1820. While this election was less polarizing than the last election due to the public agreeing on who should be president, as well as a supermajority of the states agreeing on who should be president, a civil war was still going on. I would classify this election to be the second most polarizing in American history due to it being halfway through the war. The 21st presidential election was on November 3, 1868. This election consisted of two parties. These parties were the Republican and Democratic parties. As the war was now over, the Republicans wanted to stop using the Union name and go back to calling themselves Republicans. With Lincoln being assassinated, Republicans wanted to choose a war hero as their candidate. With this, they chose Commanding General Ulysses S. Grant as their presidential candidate, and Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax as their vice presidential candidate. After being exhausted by the war, Democrats just wanted normal politicians to represent their party again. They chose former New York Governor Horatio Seymour as their presidential candidate, and former representative of Missouri's 1st District Francis Preston Blair Jr. as their vice presidential candidate. Now that the war was over, it was established that the Union's federal government would have say over national policy. This meant that Reconstruction was now the major topic of this election. The Democrats labeled Grant as the N-words candidate and themselves as the white man's candidate. It's insane to me today that you could just say that publicly and think it's a good thing. When Grant was under fire for removing Jews from his army, he apologized for saying, quote, "I have no prejudice against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit." Order number 11 does not sustain this statement, I admit, but then I do sustain that order. It would never be issued if it had not been telegraphed the moment it was penned and without reflection. The media campaigned against Seymour, stating that he was not loyal to the Union. Democrats warned of a rule of a semi-barbarous race of blacks who are worshippers of fetishes and polygamists, whatever that means. Both the Republican Party being both the victor party of the Civil War and anti-slavery, most people thought it would be right for the Republicans to decide the outcome of the war. Ulysses S. Grant ended up winning the election. He won 52.66% of the popular vote and 72.79% of the electoral vote. Although this was a poor performance for a winning candidate since the last election, it would make sense now that most southern states were given their right to vote back. As the population was still divided on who should run the country, the states still had a supermajority agreement that it should be Grant. This election was polarizing on the sense of Reconstruction, but overall the nation was finally able to cool down once again. The 22nd presidential election was on November 5th, 1872. This election consisted of 5 parties, with one party coalition. These parties were the Republican, Liberal Republican, Democratic, Straight-Out Democrats, and Prohibition parties. The coalition party was between the Liberal Republicans and Democratic parties. The Republican Party chose President Ulysses S. Grant as their nominee, and Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson as their vice presidential candidate. As some Republicans thought there was corruption within the Grant administration, they defected and formed their own party. They named this party the Liberal Republican Party. They chose former representative of New York's 6th District, Horace Greeley, as their presidential candidate, and governor of Missouri, Benjamin G. Brown, as their vice presidential candidate. With the Democrats' main goal to defeat the Republicans, they backed Horace Greeley and Benjamin G. Brown for the presidency. Grant was being accused of corruption, and liberal Republicans wanted the Reconstruction process to be brought to an end. Greeley, though, was not a good campaigner, which made winning support more difficult for him than it should have been. The women's suffrage movement was also starting during this election. This is when women were calling to have the same rights as men. Overall, Grant was able to win a second term. He won 55.58% of the popular vote and 81.25% of the electoral vote. This was the best performance in the popular vote since 1820 and the best performance in the electoral vote since 1864. As the nation was slowly agreeing more and more on who the candidate for president should be, a continuous supermajority of states agreeing on who should be president, the nation was slowly becoming less and less polarized. On top of that, Reconstruction was also coming to an end. The 23rd presidential election was on November 7th, 1876. This election consisted of 5 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Greenback, Prohibition, and American National parties. As Grant was preparing to run for a third term, the House of Representatives made a joint statement stating that Washington's tradition of only serving 2 terms was to prevent America from becoming a dictatorship. Afterwards, Grant ended his campaign for a third term. Republicans ended up choosing Governor of Ohio Rutherford B. Hayes as their presidential candidate, and Representative of New York's 19th District, William A. Wheeler, as their vice presidential candidate. The Democrats chose Governor of New York Samuel J. Tilden as their presidential candidate, and Governor of Indiana Thomas A. Hendricks as their vice presidential candidate. The Greenbacks Party was created in support of mass printing paper money known as greenbacks, the predecessor of the treasurer notes, or cash, that we know today. They chose Peter Cooper as their presidential nominee and Samuel Fenton Cary as their vice presidential candidate. The Prohibition Party was created in support of making the creation and consumption of alcohol illegal. They chose Green Clay Smith as their presidential nominee and Gideon T. Stewart as their vice presidential candidate. The American National Party ran on, quote, Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, international aberration, the reading of the scriptures in public schools, peace payments, justice for Native Americans, abolition of the Electoral College, and prohibition of the sale of alcoholic beverages. They declared the first day of the week to be a day of rest for the United States. The platform opposed secret societies and monopolies. They chose James Walker as their presidential nominee and Donald Kirkpatrick as their vice presidential nominee. Tilden ran on ending corruption within the government. Democrats ran on Republicans being corrupt, while Republicans ran on Democrats being rebels. Democrats criticized Hayes for being unpopular, while the media attacked Tilden on the way he looked. A small minority of Democrats would physically attack anyone who looked like they would vote Republican. In the end, Hayes ended up winning the election. For the first time in American history, a president lost the popular vote but still won the electoral vote. Tilden won 50.92% of the popular vote, while Hayes won 47.92%. Hayes did win 50.14% of the electoral vote. As the minority was actually able to win the election for the first time, this election was very polarizing and brought up the validity of the Electoral College. So what can we learn from this age in politics? The best thing a politician can do is split a country in half to call your opponent the destroyer of the nation. And I want to get into this a bit more than I planned because I was writing this as of September 15th, 2024. And former President Donald Trump had his second assassination attempt against him this year. The first being on July 13th, 2024, just a couple months ago. And as I write about the Civil War, when a political assassination attempt happens more than once in one election cycle, it does make me fear that we are blindly walking ourselves into a civil war-like environment. Democrats have been campaigning against Donald Trump by saying that he will become a fascist dictator if he's elected, and the media as well has been calling Trump a fascist, Nazi, and the second coming of Hitler. As most people brush that aside as nonsense propaganda, crazy people do listen to the same media that we do. And as we've seen twice now already, this rhetoric has convinced two crazy people to make their lives meaning to kill the presidential candidate. We cannot afford to throw ourselves near the edge of a potential civil war just so one party can have power for just a short period of time. And I don't want to victim blame, but Republicans cannot respond by calling Democrats communist authoritarians. We need to learn to agree to disagree respectfully and understand that both parties want what's best for the country. Each party just wants to improve certain sectors of the country. It's a shame that we have let ourselves to come to this. Both parties have turned the American people into a group of blindfolded people with branded knives in their hands. It is our choice to take the blindfold off and see what these politicians and media figures have done to us, or keep the blindfold on and continue stabbing at each other, not knowing why or how we are doing so.